Recently here at Tech Yes City, I stumbled my way upon some magical old school bulldozer chips. So we had an 8350, an 8320, a 9370, and then in here I've got another 8350. And so I had a working motherboard and I got these chips for dirt cheap. I think for the whole bundle USD wise, it would have been about 50 USD. And I also got a broken motherboard with that too. And so that one unfortunately doesn't power on. And so I figured before I build out these PCs, while I got these two setups here, I might as well run some benchmarks with some of the latest titles and see who the real winner is. And with this setup right here, it's a 970 motherboard and it's got 16 gigabytes of 1600 megahertz memory. This is just your bottom of the barrel Lenovo motherboard. It's even got an adapter on it. And so this is kind of the setups I do come into realistically. I'm not going to go out and buy the most expensive Z87 motherboard or the most expensive FX 990 motherboard because there is no point. It's just not realistic in terms of what I come into in terms of this gear. And even if you're on the market for this gear, I don't think you'd want to spend all that money on it anyhow. So without further ado, let's put these old FX CPUs against the old Intels and see who comes out on top. And also, I'm not going to use this at all. I'm probably just going to eBay this 9370 because it is literally a motherboard destroyer.
Today's video is brought to you by PlayStation, where they are bringing some of the highest quality AAA titles that used to be PlayStation exclusive, and now they're available on PC. The best thing is you can get them on the Steam store right now from the 22nd of December up until January 5th, up to 75% off. So some games that I purchased myself and put in my Steam library as of making this sponsor spot include Predator Hunting Grounds, which you can get for around 11 Australian dollars. And then there's also Days Gone, which looks like a really fun title. $19 discounted, 75% off. Then there's Helldivers, which is a co-op top-down shooter, and this can be had for $7. And there's also many titles with big discounts going at the moment. And the best thing is, being on PC, you get those extra features that weren't available on the PlayStation, things like uncapped frame rates, ultra-wide support, as well as DLSS if you are on an NVIDIA graphics card. So if you want to check out what games at what discounts are available, I'll put some links in the description below. But remember, you got to get in before January 5th.
So I'm looking at these benchmark numbers and I'm going to show you guys so you'll have the same eyebrow raising experience that I'm having here, where we're going to look at City Skylines first because it highlights a huge difference between these two CPUs, where we had at 1080p low settings, we had a 0.1% low of 1. That's right. The FX 8350 just pretty much pooped the bed here and couldn't get up and boogie in some parts of this game. And then the average FPS was significantly behind as well from the i7 4770. Stepping it up to 1440p high settings started to put a strain on the RTX 4060, which was the GPU we used in today's testing. Then we move over to another newly released title, RoboCop Rogue City, and here's where at 1080p we got an advantage to the Intel i7 4770, and the 0.1% lows were better here too. But then at 1440p we saw these CPUs almost matching one another, so it looks like this game is pretty well optimized. And when you strain the GPU at the 1440p high settings, the CPUs don't show much of a difference. So this would have been, out of the 5 games that we're testing here today, this is by far the best case scenario for the FX 8350, but things quickly go from good to bad when we look at Fortnite here on DX12, and here is where we saw 137 average FPS versus 100 at 1080p low settings with 100% screen resolution. And the worst thing was here was the 0.1% lows. That's the worst FPS that is going to come out. When you notice stuttering and things like that, you always look at this number, and this explains a lot. And here's where we saw 57 versus 13. And I tested the exact same area doing the same test back and forth, and the FX 8350 was just having a bit of a stuttering session. And then onto 1440p showed that 13 then went down to 4, but also the i7 4770 did drop down to 24 here. However, the GPU, the 4060, was starting to get stressed at this resolution, and the average FPS though still contained a significant lead for the i7-4770. Now onto Counter-Strike 2 at 1080p, low settings. Here's where we had 95 versus 132. So the game is pretty well optimized, and it's just showing that the Bulldozer CPU is getting bulldozed. And then on to 1440p shows the difference is starting to get minimized as the GPU starts to take more of the brunt. Now onto the last title, and I'm saving the best till last here because we've also got some power consumption results, but we got Horizon Zero Dawn, 1080p low settings, 121 average FPS versus 84, 0.1% lows also showed a significant gap. And then onto 1440p, there was still a significant gap both in the average FPS and that worst FPS that we saw there. And this is a game that maxes out both these CPUs with the RTX 4060 at 1080p low settings especially. And what we're seeing here is a huge difference between 4 cores, 8 threads, and 8 cores that people were trying to tell us back in the day was going to be in the future significantly better than the Intel counterpart. So it's just not true. And to make things worse, here's actually the worst of it all. The power consumption results. We've got here 282 watts on load versus 198 in this game while we're getting these numbers. So not only do you get that bigger FPS gap, you're also saving roughly 80 watts from the wall whilst you're doing it. And then on your desktop when you're idling, you got 128 watts idle versus 67 watts. So now with all those results out of the way, it's time for the verdict. It's time for the chopping block on both these setups. And there is one clear winner here over the other, and that is the i7-4770. It beat out the Bulldozer CPU in every benchmark we did here today, with the biggest differences I feel being those 0.1% lows, or the worst FPS that you're going to experience. I did think that the Bulldozer CPU, especially in those competitive titles, did have a major disadvantage where the stuttering was more noticeable. Now, one thing I'm going to talk about too is the usage on the desktop as well. If you've got an SSD with both these systems, there is a noticeable difference in just the general desktop usage, where once you're, say, downloading a few games on one setup versus the other, you are able to still do things relatively smoothly on the 4770 versus the 8350, which starts to... And all this testing was done on a Lenovo refurbish job that I pull out of old Office PCs and then stick an adapter on, chuck in 16 gigabytes of RAM if I need to, a HD audio adapter so people have audio, and then I chuck it into a new case. I even use the IO shield, and you get no error messages on boot, and it actually ends up being extremely good price performance. And that just absolutely slaughtered this MSI 978 SLI Crate Edition motherboard. The XMP profiles were locked in on this board. They weren't locked in at all on the i7-4770 so if we had a better solution for the Intel, it would have done even better. And another thing is too, I had a fan on the VRM just so we didn't come into any hiccups. And what we saw here was really something that's going to put the argument to rest, as we saw with those Horizon Zero Dawn benchmarks especially, but all the other games as well. We saw either a huge difference in average FPS, and if not, we saw a big difference in the 0.1% lows, where especially in the competitive titles, looking at Fortnite especially, there was a huge gap there. But when it all boils down to it, both these setups can still game at an average FPS of at least 60 FPS in most titles in 2023 and going on to 2024. They both work comfortably, especially in DX12 titles when the games are optimized, and you're going to have a decent experience on either. But the biggest thing for me personally is when I chuck these in a budget banger gaming PC, it's going to ring true to the age-old saying, and this applies perfectly with these two CPUs, and that is there's no such thing as a bad product, only a bad price. And here is where if you get these CPUs and motherboard and RAM cheap enough, then it's going to be good value. In fact, the Bulldozer CPUs, I'm picking them up for dirt cheap. A lot of times I'll get motherboards given to me with other deals that I pick up, and so I can utilize that in a really low-end gaming PC and still make a healthy profit off either architecture. But for me personally, if I was looking for one or the other, I'd definitely be picking the 4770. It just has a much more contemporary experience, and actually it's shockingly good for how old it is and what it can do in 2023. Though I will quickly interlude here and I will go back down memory lane, back to when both these setups were in their prime. And I remember this argument of more cores is going to be more relevant in the future. And then coming back now to these results, we can see that more cores on the FX 8350 really just wasn't doing anything for that CPU, especially when it got loaded up in those games at 100% on all cores. It still lost out to the 4770. And with that desktop usage difference, it does make me wonder, with reviewers who had both these setups at the time, and they were saying not just that the FX 8350 was better value, but they were just flat out saying the FX 8350 was better. I wonder if those guys at the time had a blindfold on when they were testing both these setups, because the differences were very noticeable when you coupled it in with an SSD. Anyway guys, the final point is it is summer here in Australia, so I would be opting to use the 4770, though if you are somewhere else in the world and you do want to heat up your room a little bit, you may wish to consider going with an 8350 because it will do a good job of pulling more watts from the wall and creating more heat in your room. Also, in terms of pricing, if you wonder what I pay for both these CPUs, usually my max bid on an i7 4770 is around 35 USD, and then on the Bulldozer chips, I don't pay any more than usually 15 USD a pop. And so that's sort of like my max prices on these. The i7, of course, has that i7 name, and that does do great when it comes to flipping budget gaming PCs. And another cool thing I'll mention as well, if you're looking for a cheap alternative to the i7 4770, there is the 1230 V3, which is essentially the same thing minus the onboard graphics, but you can get them even off AliExpress for very cheap. At this point in time, I actually ordered 3 of these recently, so I'm waiting for them to come in and put them in budget flips too. Anyway guys, with all that aside, I hope you enjoyed today's revisit of the i7 4770 versus the FX 8350. If you did, be sure to hit that like button. Also let us know in the comments section below, have you come into either of these budget architectures, and if so, what deals were you getting on them? Because I do love reading what deals you guys pick up all the time down in those comment sections. And we've also got the question of the day here, which comes from the Mystical Nelson 2163, and they ask, hey Brian, do you have people there that put up hugely inflated prices? How do you deal with those? People in my area always listing stuff but asking way more than it's worth. And so this is about used parts. If you guys didn't know, and this is your first video here, I do use PC Parts Hunts of the month, and so I'm always looking for a good deal. Now, of course, there is always going to be those prices that are just exorbitant, especially for what that product is. And so the best way to deal with that is to see how long the listing's been up for. If it's been up for a while, you can just put in a sort of half price offer or something like that and see if they'll take it. If not, then you just tell them, well, look, I can get this product off AliExpress delivered to my door cheaper than what you're selling it for. And even sometimes they do come down actually significantly in price. I found that recently, especially with a Ryzen 7 3700X. And so if you're just seeing all the time these stupid prices on your marketplace locally, I would just circumvent it and go buy off somewhere like AliExpress, because at the end of the day, especially if you're doing this to flip PCs, you'd want to be getting the best value for your dollar. Though in terms of both these setups right here, I actually have to go piece these right in a gaming PCs right now because I've got orders coming up for Christmas and I've got to make magic happen. And if you guys have stayed this far and you're enjoying that Tech Yes content, then you know what to do, and I will catch you in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye.